All right, welcome. Hello, everyone. I want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to our second Golden Lily Academy virtual event and our first forum. Thank you for joining us today for a reading and conversation with Dr. Amra Sabic-El-Rayess on her memoir, A Cat I Never Named, a true story of love, war, and survival. My name is Bihać, and I am the Director of Community Relations for Congress of North American Bosniaks. I will moderate today's discussion. The program is scheduled for an hour, but we may go up to 75 minutes, depending on how many questions we have at the end. Please submit your questions in the chat box on the right, on the right side of the screen, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can during the Q&A section of the program. Dr. Amra Sabic-El-Rayess is a professor, author, and activist who grew up in Bihać, Bosnia and Herzegovina. After surviving the genocide and 1,150 days under the Serbs' military siege, she emigrated to the United States in 1996. By December 1999, she earned a BA in economics from Brown University. Later, she obtained 2 master's degrees and a doctorate from Columbia University. Currently, she is an associate professor of practice at Columbia University's Graduate School of Education in the Education Policy and Social Analysis Department. Her scholarship focuses on mechanisms and factors that drive societies towards social disintegration and what role education can play in rebuilding decimated countries. Amra has worked as the expert on behalf of the US State Department, foreign governments, other global organizations. She is an interdisciplinary scholar who has taught, researched, published, and lectured around the world on education's links to social transformations, radicalization, corruption, elite formation, and violence. Her recent Al Jazeera op-ed examines the stark parallels between the white supremacy movement in the US and Islamophobia that ignited the genocide in Bosnia. Her just published, critically acclaimed memoir, The Cat I Never Named, is a timely warning to Americans against othering, radicalization, and hate. Amra's story is a remarkable journey of humanity, resilience, and determination to gain education and counter hate, even in the face of the unimaginable. Her memoir has been described as Anne Frank's story if Frank hadn't perished during the Holocaust. The Cat I Never Named is a finalist for the 2021 Excellence in Nonfiction Award. Publishers Weekly characterizes Amra's book as a memoir about the transformative power of love, connection, and education, as timely as it is effective. Amra's story converges with so many of our current cultural touchpoints: racism, tribalism, exploding Islamophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, radicalization, the rise of hate groups, white supremacy, far-right movement, BLM, civil unrest, and social disintegration. Her work inspires us to stay hopeful in a country that many no longer recognize. You can follow Amra and her work on all social media platforms, as well as her website, www.sabicelrayess.com. It is truly an honor to have Amra with us today to share her moving and harrowing journey. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Amra, who will give us a reading, and then Amra and I will engage in a conversation and will answer some of your questions. Amra, over to you.
Thank you so much, Vahida, for the lovely introduction, for inviting me to join this conversation today. I am also excited to be speaking to a Bosnian community. I have delivered various lectures and talked about this book around the world, but have not engaged in many conversations with our Bosnian particularly Bosniak community in relation to my work and my book. And so I'm really excited about this evening. And I'm going to start by reading a section from the book for only a few minutes to really get our conversation going. And this particular section, for anyone who perhaps comes from Bihać, will know the significance of the Blue Bridge in my hometown. And this is a moment when, months into the war, I am about to cross the Blue Bridge for the first time. I left my home without telling my parents that I would go and tell a friend of mine in the other part of the city that the school is about to start. As those who read my book and who have heard your introduction know, I was quite the nerd. And so I was very excited that the school was going to start. Then I hear a whistling overhead, a thin, reedy sound. An instant later, I see a flash as a missile hits a house on the bank of the Una, on my home side of the bridge. The sound of the explosion comes an instant later, and I stand frozen, bizarrely thinking about physics, about the relative speed of light and sound that cleaves the experience in two. First, the sight of fire and flame, then, disconnected by a second or two, sound waves that roll over me like messengers eager to bear bad news. I hear another missile overhead, launched from the mountains surrounding our town. Someone told Tata, who told me in turn, the bomb that you hear is not the one with your name on it. If you hear it whistle, it's because it's flying over your head to somewhere else. You never hear a whisper from the bomb that kills you. The air raid sirens start its high-pitched howl then. We have no radar, nothing to tell us that the missiles are inbound. So the siren is a joke. It just serves to remind us that people are being killed. It gives no warning, just wails and mourns with the rest of us. Davor and I find each other again. We're still frozen in place, not knowing if we're about to die. But our eyes meet across the bridge. Between us, I see the mother and her little boy, the girl in the green sweater, a trio of middle-aged women who look like sisters. Davor takes a step toward me. Then the air seems to be sucked out of the world as I'm hit with an earth-shattering, deafening explosion. There's a flash between Davor and me, and I'm blinded. Metal and stone are flying around me. I turn to run, and it's only when my legs are moving that I realize I'm not dead. I only make it a few steps before I fall, scraping my knees. In the dust and chaos, I hear screams, and I drag myself to my feet, stunned. My ears are ringing, and the air is choked with dust. I smell smoke. I taste smoke. There is grit on my tongue. The Blue Bridge is still standing. The bomb struck a glancing blow that didn't do anything much to the structure, but the pedestrians on the bridge. Against every survival instinct, I make myself walk back towards the other end of the bridge. I look all around, but don't see Davor. The little boy, the one who wanted to look at fish over the side of the bridge, is standing in the middle of a cloud of masonry dust. His mouth is open. And at first, I think the sound he's making is part of the loud ringing in my ears, because everything sounds weirdly muffled at first. The sounds are returning to my ears one at a time. Then I realize he's screaming, a long, drawn-out, terrible cry that stops only when he's out of breath, then starts again after a ragged gasp. I go to him. He's blonde, tussle-haired, and blue-eyed, just like Dino when he was younger. But his little face looks impossibly old. I wish he could be confused. I wish he didn't know exactly what just happened. But this little boy understands his loss, and he's suffused with helpless, inarticulate rage. I go to him, reaching out my hand. He just stares at me with his prematurely aged face. I look beyond him. blood on a stylish suit, the fox fur collar, made from a whole fox, its sharp white teeth grinning as it grasps its own tail. Its black glass eyes are staring at me. Above that, nothing. There is nothing where his mother's head should be. He finds words now, and his screams turn into a desperate wail for his mother. He's not looking at her, but he must have seen. He's calling to her like his words could turn back time, undo the bomb. Like if he begs the universe loudly enough, he can make his mother alive again. I take his little hand and he looks at me like I'm an alien thing. I try to lead him off the bridge, but he's like a boulder, immovable. All this time, he never stops screaming his feral fury against the world. An old man staggers beside us. A couple clings to each other as they walk through the smoke. Though it's midday, the smoke and dust make it look like a foggy evening. Survivors are like ghosts in the haze. I still don't see Davor, not among the bodies or the survivors. The little boy's grief shatters me. There's nothing I can do, so I leave him. It's a wrenching decision, but someone will come to help him. I look at the other people on the bridge. The three middle-aged sisters are strewn about like old clothes. That's what I see. Their old lady sweaters and their sensible shoes. A man is hanging half of the bridge, draped over the rail. Blood is dripping in a puddle at his feet. Then I see the girl in the green sweater like mine. She's on the ground, curled on her side, facing away from me. Her sweater is perfectly clean and tidy. Like she just decided to take a nap in this odd place. I think she's unconscious. Maybe she was knocked out by this shock wave. I kneel at her side and take her shoulder, gently turning her over as I say, "Don't worry, I'm here. I'll help you." I roll her and I find the bloody horror. The front of her body stripped of clothes, stripped of skin, shredded from a hail of metal and stone shrapnel. From the front, she doesn't look human. She looks like meat. I scream and scramble backward on my hands and feet like a crab, wiping my bloody hands on the ground. They make a red paste with the dust. I roll to my knees, haul myself to my feet, look around for somebody, anybody who can do something. Suddenly, there are lights up ahead in the middle of the road where we're walking. It's a big square white lorry with the tall blue letters on the side, UN. The United Nations is supposed to be here to help the suffering, to facilitate peace. With a gasp of relief, I run to meet the truck, waving my hands to stop them. "Help is here," I shout to the little boy as I pass him. "These men will help you." I'm standing in the middle of the road, right in the truck's path. It slows. The driver sees me. He meets my eye. "Please have medics," I think. "Please have some kind of counselor who can take care of this poor child. Please have someone to compassionately tend to the poor girl's body to cover her ravaged face." But the UN truck swerves around me, increasing speed. Okay, I think. They're going to the wounded in the center of the bridge. But the truck doesn't stop. It drives fast enough to make the damaged bridge shake. It swerves carefully around the carnage and rubble and carries on as if dead Bosnians weren't sprawled on the streets. The world is watching, and it doesn't care. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Amra. That was extremely powerful and a very vivid and emotional introduction to the book. Most of the participants in our virtual audience today, including myself, share a lot of these painful, traumatic experiences and emotions, but we tend to suppress and avoid both the memories of these experiences and the emotions that come with them because they're simply too painful. it really requires a lot of courage to face our past like you did in here. Can you talk a little bit about navigating this process of tapping into these traumatic childhood memories without completely traumatizing yourself?
Well, that's a complicated question, as all of you who are here tonight understand, given our own personal and our family's experiences. But for me, there was a moment involving my own child, born and raised in New York City, who was a third grader a couple of years ago, who came home one day and asked me, "Mom, what will happen to me and Jana, her older sister, if you and Dad are rounded up as Muslims and taken away?" And that was really a moment that shocked me, jolted me, made me realize that it was time for me to sit down and write this story, that in doing my own cost benefit analysis, that there was a greater benefit to the world of being aware of a story of a Bosnian genocide than there was a cost to me personally in going back into some of these traumatic experiences. And I have to say, it wasn't easy. They were days when I wrote for 15, 16 hours a day, and multiple days in a row, in order to focus on finishing a particular chapter, certain pages that I sobbed through, but also pages that I had laughed through, that were positive memories of our own strength and resilience, that made me gain the sense of self-empowerment by putting it down on paper. So I would say that for me, the process was initially terrifying because I didn't know if I would trigger a specific trauma or the kind of pain that I couldn't get myself out of. And so there was a lot of thinking involved in how do I go about the writing process. But once I actually started, it was very difficult to stop. And I've written probably twice as many stories as there are in the actual book because we simply couldn't publish all of them. The initial requirement for the book was 60 to 80,000 words. And this book is quite much longer than the initial word requirement that Bloomsbury had of me, largely because it was a healing process. As painful as it was also a healing process for me.
Thank you for your courage to be able to, go through that process and dig deeper into the past. So why did you decide to write the book? What is your ultimate goal or intention with this project?
So much has been written and said about us. Others have built narratives about who we are as Bosnian Muslims, whether we belong or don't belong, and what truly occurred in Bosnia. Some say it was civil war, others say it was Serbia's aggression. And I realized that I didn't need to wait for someone else to define who we are or explain what happened to us, particularly given the international platform, global platform that I have as a Columbia professor. It was, in a way, a confluence of several factors: my own personal experiences as an American Muslim, but also this realization that I am at a certain point in my professional career where me writing this story would bring a certain level of validation and also legitimacy to the experience of Bosnian genocide. And I would say there that when I say the Bosnian genocide occurred, I refer to genocide against Bosniaks, against Bosnian Muslims, that clearly occurred not only in Srebrenica, but through the entire country, where we were really decimated as a group of people and were target for gruesome killings and mass rapes for nearly 4 years. So really having a voice of a Bosnian Muslim woman in particular in this moment, historic moment, extraordinary time for the United States, with all of the issues that you had brought up: racism, Black Lives Matter, Islamophobia. I thought the moment was right to really include our story our own discrimination and genocide into really larger global conversation on exclusion and othering and hate.
So I thank you for that answer. I'm actually looking at the chat, and there's a question that I want to read because it relates to this particular topic as to the why. And the question is, Amra, we understand how important your story is for all of us, given what has been happening in the US over the last several years. However, was part of your journey in writing this book also a search for answers to your personal questions regarding your best friend and others like her who simply abandoned you, Bihać, and their country because you were a Bosnian Muslim? If so, did you find your answer?
Great question. That gives me goosebumps. I do think that for all of us, there is the sense, and I don't want to say that I speak to each and every experience, but I think collectively I've observed within my own family and many friends that we want that kind of acknowledgement that our friends, in some cases, those who married in my own family, an uncle who was a Serb, lives in Belgrade, was part of Yugoslav National Army. There was this desire to understand how and why did this hate go so deep that some of the people that I had dearly loved were capable of engaging in really execution of genocide in one way or another, or if not partaking in the genocide, then really being complicit in the process and not speaking out against it. And so I would say that I stopped a long time ago looking for validation from those who were either complicit or who endorsed genocide, because I think we will never get there. I think people who, after all of the evidence, after all of the proceedings in the International War Crimes Tribunal, after all of the stories told and exposed in terms of historic texts, if they still choose to believe that genocide didn't happen, I'm not sure that my story or my own self-exploration would convince them otherwise. But I wanted to really, with this story, do something slightly different. And that was to legitimize my experience, because even before the war, as a Bosnian Muslim girl who was quite the nerd, I know that there is a dear friend of mine, Elvisa Shumar, who is from Bihać, who attended the same high school that I did in Bihać. And so I was known as someone very much dedicated to my studies in all of the subjects. But I've never read a story like The Cat I Never Named that had Amra or Vahida or Elvisa as a main character. And I wanted to create that story, not just for me and for my children, but also for American kids, for kids from around the world who may have never read a story that positively portrays resilience and the strength of a Muslim girl or of a Muslim boy. And many of them do appear in my book, including my own brother. So I think it was more a process where I critically reflected on my experience, what it meant to me, and what it will mean to others, more so than how it answers any questions relating to friends that I really lost a long time ago.
That is a beautiful and also very inspiring. Your response gave me goosebumps. You mentioned hate, and in the book, you say that hate is stronger than love. Can you talk about the feeling of being hated, and how do we counter narratives that are fueled by hatred, especially in diverse societies like the USA?
I'm going to say that for me, in particular, as a professor at Columbia, and I have to say that I am at the Graduate School of Education, and of several hundred professors, full-time faculty members, I am the only faculty member that I know who is Muslim. So there is for me, there's the self-awareness that as Muslims in particular, we're often perceived as dangerous, as violent. We're equated to terrorists. We've seen what happened at the Capitol Hill here in the United States. Those individuals are being called a mob, an American mob, if they were by any chance Muslims, and if there were 30,000 Muslims marching into the Capitol in Washington, D.C., there would be no question that they would have been called terrorists. And so there's this really tight bond between the imagery of Muslims and violence and war that is closely linked to hatred. And I think through our own experience, we've seen the power of that imagery, where Bosnia, that was largely secular, clearly there were no insurgents, there were no terrorist activities, but we were portrayed as ethnic impurity. We were portrayed as people who needed to be decimated and eliminated from former Yugoslavia and later from Bosnia. And so in that sense, I believe that hatred is incredibly powerful emotion, and it's not exclusive to any one group of people, as we have seen in the United States. And the only really effective way to counter it is to have a multi-pronged approach. There has to be more done to counter hate in the media, in social media, and it has to be done in partnership with education. I counter hate every day, every lecture that I deliver, but it is not enough because formal education cannot penetrate into all of the segments of society in the way that social media does. And so some of the conversations that I'm having in my own professional setting is, how do we do that? How do we change the mindsets of people who have this deeply ingrained hatred towards the other, whoever the other is? And I think stories like The Cat I Never Named are a beginning. I'll give you an example that I have received, for instance, many emails from parents who have reached out to me and said, my child, my teen got your book. It was highly recommended by a teacher, by a friend, but I don't know anything about Muslims. And in a way, I wanted to check out the book before my child reads it. And then the parents inevitably email me and say, it's 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. and I couldn't stop reading your book. And you've educated me, you changed the way I look at Muslims, and I'm grateful for that. So I think we need more of that. I hope The Cat I Never Named is not the first book of this kind for Americans, but only one of many. I hope that I inspire others to write their own stories.
So given what's going on, what recently happened on the Capitol Hill, and all the polarity as a result of, some of the hatred, what can we learn from our experience, and what is your message, to Americans and the world, really?
Often we talk about in the United States of this notion of American exceptionalism, that America is exceptional, that America is in some privileged ways more civilized, more modern, more inclined to respect human rights and inclusion and diversity than other nations. And as you mentioned, I had worked as an expert abroad for the State Department a couple of years ago. I traveled to Azerbaijan and delivered a couple of lectures on anti-corruption, transparency, human rights, education, and got quite a few questions from people asking me, how do you reconcile what you stand for with what is happening in the United States? And I think the United States is at the moment of really reckoning with herself and understanding that there are many issues with hatred, with racism, with othering, with Islamophobia that it struggles with as much as any other nation. And I think being humble and admitting that that is a substantive problem, I hope, will help the next administration in particular to think about more innovative ways to counter it. As I mentioned, through social media, education, and certainly through many other industries.
Going kind of along the same subject of those negative, hate, etc. One of the themes in the book is bullying, which is also a very relevant issue today in the USA, and how you continuously and courageously stand up against bullying, not only for yourself, but also for others. Why is it important to stand up for others in these situations like you did? And what is your advice to those who are bullying? Like, how do they handle these types of situations?
I wouldn't say that I'm any braver or any better as a person than anyone else. But I think we do have a choice to make anytime we encounter difficult circumstances or any type of bullying. And I think our experience of what we had gone through and understanding that not many people stood up and said, this is not the right thing to do to our fellow Muslims, fellow Bosnians, is something that is deeply ingrained in me. And I think I made a self assessment of who I want to be as a person long time ago, and really determined that for me, it's important to speak out. And it's also, particularly when one is in a position of being an educator, it's important to really act on what we preach. I can't be in the classroom preaching how we counter exclusion and how we solve problems without really being someone who in practice does that. And I would say there's also a personal element to it. I had an older brother who I mentioned in the book who died from a sudden heart attack when he was only 15 before the war started. Amar was brilliant. He had photographic memory. He was an incredibly beautiful mind. But he suffered from Marfan syndrome, which I believe even Abraham Lincoln had a version of it. And unfortunately, my brother died as we were moving into our new home. In fact, on the day that my parents built a house and we were moving into a new house, and Amar passed away. But I grew up as his younger sister, constantly defending him because he was bullied very frequently because he had difficulty walking. And as someone who was superbly intelligent, he was aware of how difficult it was for him to be accepted by the mainstream society, particularly as a young boy. He couldn't play soccer, he couldn't play sports, and I was always taking care of him. I was often carrying him up the steps. We didn't have accommodations for disabled children in former Yugoslavia, so I would carry him up the stairs in school and protect him anytime he was attacked, verbally or sometimes physically. And so that stayed with me and deeply affected me. And I consider it part of my normal daily life to speak up when I feel it's the right thing to do.
And that's the only way we can really bring about change and counter hatred. In one of your interviews, you mentioned that you can't hate despite what happened to you and your family during the war. How do we not feel hate towards those that committed these atrocities to us? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course. And I would lie, as you know from the book, you read the book, so that there are moments where I do feel in the book that I really want to hate these people. And certainly I was in many ways tempted along the way. But I think the ultimate hope for me is that all of us who are victims do not perpetuate the same kind of emotions or behaviors as the kinds of emotions and behaviors that excluded and targeted us, because then we become the perpetrators of really the same type of behaviors that affected us adversely. And so it is a hard decision, but it is a deliberate decision. And I also think hate is not constructive. When one hates, it is a very consuming feeling. And I want to be constructive. I want to leave a legacy that is positive. I want to positively impact change and not waste my time on hate that may be directed at me. And that hate didn't stop. I am on the receiving end of that hate even today.
Thank you. In one part of your book, you said, "I want to be Amra Sabic, no one else, even if pretending to be someone else can be at times easier." Why is keeping our identity and authenticity important?
That's a great question. And in fact, I've gotten so many emails or letters from people who have asked, how did you get your book published? And how did you decide what stories to tell? And my message is always, all the other stories are really taken by someone else, because they're someone else's stories. They're someone else's identities. And the story or the identity I feel most comfortable in is the one that I choose to be in. And I luckily for me, I had survived and I had opportunity to gain education. And perhaps we shouldn't judge those who may have harder time in life than I had had in terms of success, who may fear that being Muslims may be a barrier. And it certainly is. I've experienced Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism along the way in my own professional and personal growth. So I never judge people for the choices that they make, but I do think that it impairs one's own self-confidence, because we always know who we are. And so hiding under some sort of mask or disowning who you are probably doesn't feel good. And in terms of research in education, we do know that those people who are most successful who come from backgrounds that are difficult or have gone through some kind of adversity are typically people who are able to adapt to the new environment, but also keep their identity from the prior experiences intact and find a way to sort of harmonize it with whatever it is that they learn in the new environment. So I don't think that my identity as a Bosniak is mutually exclusive with identity of being Bosnian, or identity of being American Muslim, or identity of being a mom, or identity of being a professor or researcher or an author. I take pride in having a multitude of identities and never really felt that I need to disown something in order to advance in life. But I do understand, because of the prevalence of Islamophobia, that some people may feel that way.
So I'm going to pivot to a couple questions from the chat and then get back to the questions that I have. And the question is, what was the hardest part of the book to write about? What scene or memory?
That's a great question. I think the hardest part for me was to write the end, because in a way I was parting with being in the story for a while. Obviously, it takes a long time to write a book. And once I got into that world, and I have to say, I have a playlist. I'm happy to share it if anyone is interested. I can always email it to you. I have a specific playlist of Bosnian music that I was listening to as I was writing, because it would evoke emotions for me and kind of bring me back into the mindset that I needed to be in to write the story. But writing the end was almost as if I was parting with Bosnia again. I won't say what happens at the end, but it's painful, it's emotional, and it felt that I was experiencing those losses yet again and closing a chapter of my life. But I'm glad that the book is out there and it's being read, and hopefully it's going to be only the first of many books that will come on Bosnia that I will be writing in the coming years.
I'd love that playlist, by the way, so if you can share it. So I'll read a couple more. Do you have any advice for those of us who have thought about writing our own stories, but have hesitated, thinking there are always worse stories than our own to be heard?
I think that stories are not about what's worse or what's better, or what you think may or may not have an impact. I think stories are sometimes very powerful in their details. And for those of you who've read my book, or for those of you who will be reading my book, you'll see that there are many authentic Bosnian details or scenes that I include in the book that actually have left a deep impression on a lot of individuals that I had interviewed with regarding my book that are not Bosnian by background. And those details are not the details that I initially expected would be the ones that they would remember as some of the most powerful moments. And so I think the writing is more about writing your authentic story and having your own original voice that doesn't try to replicate anybody else. And that is where the value of your story will come from, not necessarily on whether it is not judged on whether it's more painful or harder to describe in terms of atrocities or whatever you may have gone through personally, or the losses you've had. It is about simply being authentic and sharing your own story rather than someone else's.
Thank you. Another question. I watched your story on Face TV where you mentioned that you were working to have the book translated into Bosnian language. However, that was met with some challenges. Is there still a plan to have the book translated?
Yes, I have to say, so as you can imagine, Bosnia is a fairly small market in a larger sort of commercial sense for large publishers like my publisher Bloomsbury. But I feel very strongly that I want my book translated into Bosnian, and certainly Bloomsbury would like to do that. But we didn't, at the time when I did that interview, there were really no publishers that reached out to me to express the interest in translating the book. And Bloomsbury has global rights to publish my story in any foreign language. And so I was hoping that someone would reach out, and I have to say that several publishers have reached out, and I have connected them to with the team for foreign rights at Bloomsbury, and I think they're working on those deals. I'm not necessarily involved in those specific negotiations, but I am very, very hopeful that the book, that I will hear some good news that the book actually will be translated. And I'm hoping that it will be translated to other languages as well. And for those of you who are interested in following that, I do have a Facebook page, LinkedIn page, Twitter page, and certainly I will share the news there once that becomes official.
Thank you. And I truly hope the book gets translated into Bosnian as well. Another question, Amra, we have a number of young professionals participating in this event. What advice do you have for them?
There's so much, there's so much that I could say because the question is really open. I would say that here's one quick advice or recommendation. Please go ahead and read after this conversation tonight a very brief essay called Inner Rings. Inner Rings was written by C.S. Lewis. It is available for free online. It's maybe a couple of pages, but it was written in, I believe, in 1944, delivered as a speech at the commencement, either at Cambridge or Oxford. In this particular essay, he talks about how often we have this misconception that we need to be, in a way, popular, that we need to be in some kind of inner ring, that the way humans behave and think we are trying to be included. And those kinds of trends start with being popular or not in 6th or 7th grade. I can tell you I was not popular when I when I was a kid. I was too tall. I was taller than all the boys. Growing up, I played volleyball. I wore big glasses, but I was a complete nerd. What I learned through the course of my life is that what I benefited the most was really focusing on developing my own competence and expertise in various areas. And that is what ultimately will bring you out on the top professionally. So in terms of social hierarchy, in terms of professional hierarchy, irrespective of the industry or domain that you're in, because no one can deny your expertise. And it is the expertise that will bring you into sort of the inner ranks of decision makers, people who have a voice, people who are listened to, or who become leaders. And so my advice would be, learn everything that you can learn within your areas of expertise and beyond, and that will open the doors. And read this Inner Ring essay, because I assigned it to all of my students at Columbia in a course where we study the formation of the elites in societies, because I think it's a very insightful piece.
Great, thank you. Another question. As a mom of 2 girls, what is your advice to parents, caregivers who want to make sure the next generations understand and remember our history?
First of all, I would have them read The Cat I Never Named. To the extent that they're, I think recommended age is 12 years and older. And my intent really in writing this book was to educate the younger. This is a crossover in terms of the type of the book, meaning it's for young adults, it's appropriate in terms of language, but also it is appropriate for obviously the adults. I think it's important to expose them to our history. Sometimes it's very difficult for them to take a history book and read and think about statistics and trends. And I say that as someone who's taught statistics as well at Columbia. And so I know that history needs to be made alive and told through a story that's compelling. And that is what I attempted to do with the Cat I Never Named. And to the extent that you can share your stories of your own survival, your own resilience, I know I've done that with my children. I have two girls who speak Bosnian, who love Bosnia. They want to go back, even though my husband is not Bosnian, so he has a different background, but still, it was very important to me that they are very proud of who they are, and they certainly are. This is something that they prominently feature in talking about who they are and about themselves. And they know all of the stories from The Cat I Never Named and more.
And I think that is great advice. The first and the best thing we can do is really to retain our language. Like, your daughters were born here. In an effort to not only remember our history, but also maintain and retain our culture and heritage. Another question, what would you recommend to young generations, especially young girls, to get more involved in community involvement on a global scale to close the gap of thinking between young diasporas and young Bosnians living in Bosnia?
I would say, so it depends on what age you are and where the individual is in their life. But one of the first recommendations that I would make is, and again, it's really the channel for me always goes back to education. I think being an excellent student, being a leader, if we're talking about the younger child, let's say teens, being leader in one's own community allows children to bring in the conversations that matter to them, to explore different connections. And then particularly at the college level. I know that there is, for instance, a young woman from the American University here in the US who reached out to me, who is doing some collaborative project with several universities in Bosnia, and we will be doing something together. And so in that way, by engaging me, I'm empowering her, but I'm also working on empowering those who are both in Bosnia and both here in the United States who are interested in these issues. So my recommendation would be to really look for small and then larger opportunities where one can make a difference. I'll give you an example of my younger daughter who is in a 7th grade and who decided to write a research paper on Muslim women and Islamophobia. And as part of her work, her teacher was impressed enough to ask her to co-teach a class with her in 7th grade on this topic. So that may seem as a small opportunity of engagement, but to me, I think it's deeply meaningful. And to a young person at that age, it can be really impactful in terms of forming their own sense of identity and sense of purpose and what they can do in the world to change the world to be a better place. So that's what I would say. For young people in college after pandemic, go to every lecture that you can go to of a well-respected individual at the university where you are. Introduce yourself, exchange an email, reach out to them. It is impossible to predict where potentially very productive relationships may emerge later on in your life if you make those initial contacts.
That is great advice. Thank you. Another question. Thank you for reading from your book. I was really touched by how you described the experience of the boy losing his mother. Do you know what happened to him?
I don't. I don't know what happened to him. I don't know his name. What happened on the bridge is exactly what I described in that moment. And of course, if you read the book, you will see what happens next after I leave the bridge. But I will never forget his face. I will never forget the scene. And I will never forget the pain and the rage that I saw in his face. But I don't know his name and I don't know what happened to him.
Question here. A suburb here in Australia in the early 2000s that was filled with fresh migrants from former Yugoslavia. I'd often observe people's reactions and views on the topic of the war. Through your research, what do you see being the main effects on society and aftermath of the war? And what approach do you recommend for future generations? That we educate ourselves and others on what really happened without biased opinion so that future generations can live more harmoniously and not repeat history. I know it's a fully loaded, a couple of questions in one, but.
Of course, I think it's a wonderful thing that you were thinking about that question, that question is being asked. I think the greatest challenge is this difficulty that some people have with accepting what has been done in terms of the genocide against Bosnian Muslims. I think it's very difficult for Bosnians to reconcile whether within the country proper or all of us within different diaspora communities without really an open conversation and acknowledgement that yes, what I described in The Cat I Never Named is what happened to me. Why did it happen to me? It only happened to me because I was a Bosnian Muslim kid. Should we call persecution of an entire group of people based on their ethnic belonging and religious affiliation a genocide? Yes, we should. And so I think those are really very simple, based on the evidence that exists, very simple things to address. The challenge is that in politics, as we see in the United States, fear and hate are the two most powerful emotions because they allow people to retain their fiefdoms. They allow people to retain the control. They allow people to corrupt societies. And unfortunately, in post-war Bosnia, and I would say even more broadly in the post-war Balkans, a lot of politicians have built their careers on evoking fear, on endorsing lies, or not admitting to what has happened in Bosnia. And so I think that that needs to be a first step. And my hope is that young people can take that step. For those of us who may be older, who may not have all the skills that the younger generation has. And so I would hope that with this question, you actually think about the things that you can do as an individual to have open conversations on these issues.
Thank you. Another question. I strongly agree with the educational aspect of promoting change. Do you think that if the chilling historical patterns, particularly in oppressed cultures, are exposed, would it be enough to change the perception of those who go home and are surrounded by racist views? Is it enough to eliminate hate by eliminating ignorance?
I think education has an important role to play, but I also think it's important for us to appeal to people's emotions because emotions are extremely powerful. There's part of our brain that's very rational in our thinking, and then there's irrational part of our brain where a lot of emotions reside. And one of the things that I had realized, particularly in teaching as a professor at Columbia and teaching early on in my career, a lot of statistics courses, I realized that I am going to bore my students to death if I give them just numbers, if I give them formulas, if I don't contextualize it into a larger story. So anytime I taught them a particular technique to study an issue, I related to them how meaningful it was to get the analysis right, how consequential it was to get it wrong, how it would impact people because policies may be made based on the kinds of analysis that we do. And that is really what motivates particularly young people to change their mindsets and to think about something slightly differently. So even with my book, my goal was to really evoke empathy, to have a reader forget who they are, to forget what they think about Muslims, to forget that perhaps they have Islamophobic views, and to fall in love with the characters and their resilience and their strength and their lifestyle that is authentically Bosnian, and to appreciate that cultural heritage. And so I think empathy is extremely important. And in the work that I do on radicalization, for instance, we do know that developing empathy is critical in preventing young people from engaging in violence. So in addition to sort of the informational aspects of education, developing critical thinking, critical engagement, empathy is probably one of the most important emotions for us to try to evoke.
Thank you, Amra. Another good question. Thank you for your presentation and all the great advice. Many young Bosnians who are now college students and high school students whose parents arrived here as refugees clearly experience generational trauma that is passed on to them from what their parents went through. What can we do in working with this youth to address this trauma?
Again, it's a difficult question, and I'm not necessarily a trauma expert, so I don't want to suggest that I am. I can speak from my own personal experience that certainly, yes, my children knew about genocide and they knew about mass killings and mass rapes well before any of their peers did. And there's certainly a traumatizing element of realizing that your parents were in that kind of unsafe environment and were at risk of dying very early on in life, which I think is awareness that most second generation Bosniaks have about their parents. But I would say one aspect of healing that I think is very important is having conversations about those emotions and healings. And often it's not easy. I know that it's not easy because of the emails that I've gotten. I think I've shared with Vahida that I only started my Facebook page really because of the book, public page, sometimes at the end of August before the book came out in September. And I have been contacted in one way or another by over 250,000 people, many of whom are Bosnians, many of whom shared their entire stories, their entire traumas. And it is apparent to me that this is still something that is very fresh for the generation that has experienced it, and that sometimes they have a difficulty talking about it, and that sometimes the second generation is not aware of all the stories and all of all that has happened, but they read my book and they begin to understand their parents and their parents' behaviors, expectations, feelings a little bit better. So my hope is that, as I know has happened in many families, that maybe this book initiates that conversation within several generations of people. I've seen photos on Amazon, I think, of one, and many people have sent it to me privately, but someone posted publicly a photo of it's a father with his little daughter who is reading a book to him. And I thought that was extremely powerful. And so maybe there's a way to use this story to engage within your own family, to understand yourselves and your own emotions and dynamic a little bit better, that would help the healing process.
That's true. We have to start with ourselves and our immediate circles in order to be able to make any kind of impact in the world. I will ask one more question from the chat, and then if I can ask a closing question in Bosnian, and then we'll wrap up. So the question is, Amra, in one of your previous interviews, you said that silent racists are the most dangerous ones. How do we recognize them, since they try so hard to stay low and do the harm to those they hate?
That's a tough question, and that is why silent racism or institutionalized racism is very difficult to eradicate. In fact, a couple of days ago, I published a study that looks at, really analyzes and reviews about 20 years of literature on corruption. And I specifically focus on corruption in education around the world, where education is really used to legitimize and empower people. I think I don't need to explain to many of you that there are plenty of people who have gained diplomas and various degrees in Bosnia without really gaining expertise or doing it based on merit. But what also happens often in larger institutions, whether in education or elsewhere, is that merited mobility that should happen based on your competence, your qualifications, often does not happen, because someone may be looking at an individual based on their race, on their religion. I would say that I have been in a number of situations where, particularly because Bosniaks generally don't surprise people when we say that we are Muslim, because of the relatively fair skin tone, and because of the inherent bias about Muslims as being brown people, that they are not of European descent. In some of those instances, some of those, let's call them silent racists, have revealed themselves, because they'll make really Islamophobic, very hateful comments without realizing that they are offending me because of my background. And that's not necessarily easy to eradicate. It has to, as I said early on, we have to focus on multi-pronged approach. I think a lot has to be done in education, but processes need to be established in many institutions where any kind of silent racism, microaggressions, and exclusion based on race, religion, any other differentiating factor has to be really consequential. And that hasn't happened in the United States, as all of you know. Racism here is alive and well, but the more of us work on it, the more likely we are to actually address that issue.
Thank you. And I will ask one last, since it's past 6, I'll ask one more question in Bosnian and we will wrap up. Kroz knjigu se često spominje važnost edukacije koju su vaši roditelji potencirali već od malih nogu. Mogu nam oduzeti sve materijalne stvari, kuću, hranu, voljene, ali jednu stvar koju nam nikada ne mogu oduzeti jeste znanje. Koliko je obrazovanje važno i kakva je vaša poruka za roditelje koji imaju djecu o važnosti obrazovanja?
Upravo si jedan moment koji se ja ću podijeliti sa svima onima koji su s nama večeras. Jedan moment koji je na mene ostavio velik utisak je bio razgovor sa mojim tatom, rahmetli ocem Mehmedom Šabićem, koji je bio veliki intelektualac, koji je bio divan čovjek, koji je jedan od glavnih likova u knjizi, koji je meni u jednom momentu kad su četnici palili jedno brdo u Bihaću koje je odmah preko puta mog naselja, samo je rijeka Una dijelila nas i četnike u tom momentu. Prilazili su Sokocu i palili su sve. Osjećaj je bio da je to moment kada će Bihać pasti u ruke četnicima i da će se vjerovatno najgore nama svima desiti. I moj tata se tada, ja mislim, najviše zabrinuo za mene. Kao tada mladu djevojku i rekao mi je: Amra, sve ti mogu uzeti i vrlo je vjerovatno da ćemo mi biti ubijeni. Ti ćeš možda biti silovan, ali ako preživiš jednu stvar koju ti niko nikada ne može oduzeti je tvoja pamet i tvoje obrazovanje. I ja sam u tom momentu, naravno, imala sam tu sreću da smo preživjeli, da četnici nisu ušli u Bihać. I tada sam shvatila punu važnost i vrijednost obrazovanja. Znači, ja nisam tada ni očekivala da ću možda preživjeti rat, nisam očekivala definitivno da ću ikada završiti u Americi ili bilo gdje van Bosne i Hercegovine, ali sam se stvarno posvetila učenju. Uzela sam razne stare knjige iz fizike, iz matematike, sama sebe naučila engleski, uzela stari riječnik i sve jednu riječ naučila kako ću je napisati. Nisam ih znala izgovoriti, ali sam ih znala sve pravilno napisati. Kompletan riječnik sam naučila napamet. Da nisam odradila sve to što jesam, i naravno detalje možete pročitati u knjizi, ne bi danas bila tu gdje jesam. I meni se je nedavno, daću za primjer, javila jedna mama koja me je pitala da li bi njen sin koji je primljen na Brown univerzitet, naše dijete da kažem, da li bi on, nije ona bila sigurna da li bi on trebao da ode na Brown, da studira na Brownu. I ja sam joj tada rekla da je, i to bi rekla svima vama, da je jako bitno ako je moguće za našu djecu da dođu do najelitnijih škola, jer one pored kvalitetnog obrazovanja pružaju i mogućnost da naša djeca stupe u kontakte sa ljudima koji će jednog dana biti lideri, bilo u politici, bilo u ekonomiji, bilo u obrazovanju. I to je moje lično iskustvo. Znači da je vrsta obrazovanja koje sam ja stekla ovdje u stvari bila krucijalna u definisanju mog života danas. Kao što sam u intervju nedavno za Dnevni Avaz rekla da su 3 najveća problema u Bosni: korupcija, korupcija, korupcija. 3 najvažnije stvari, mislim, za roditelje: Naše je da ukoliko je moguće, omoguće kvalitetno obrazovanje svojoj djeci i da budu u tom smislu uporni, iako znam da nije uvijek lako.
Hvala, Amra. Naježila sam se i jako sam inspirisana i osjećam se da treba da se trudim još više i da učimo još više. Tako jaka poruka za sve nas, pogotovo za mlade. On behalf of Congress of North American Bosniaks, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did, and I hope you learned as much as I did. We have some great takeaways and advice from Dr. Amra Sabic-El-Rayess, which is education, expand your network, read the book, remember our history and our identity, who we are, and our language. I especially want to thank Dr. Amra Sabic-El-Rayess for finding the courage to relive all those atrocious, traumatic experiences, to be able to share the story with the world about the genocide in Bosnia. Thank you, Amra, for being our voice, for being our light for all of us. For more information about the Lilly Academy upcoming events, please visit the events section of our website, www.bosniak.org. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter and you will receive notifications. We want to stay connected with you. So if you have any feedback, suggestions, ideas, thoughts, please email us at knab@bosniak.org. Thank you again. Enjoy your evening and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you, everyone.